Hello, and welcome to the Ultimate Strategy Podcast, your go-to podcast for everything strategy. Each week, we'll share a new episode covering a wide range of topics designed to help your business grow smarter by making strategy both approachable and actionable. I am Miriam Lisa, Strategy Execution Director here at Cascade.
And I'm Laura Blackmore, Head of Strategy Execution. Hello and welcome. We are very excited to have you with us today. This is just the beginning, so stay tuned for weekly episodes. Before we dive in, let me thank today's sponsor, Cascade. Cascade is the #1 strategy execution platform. It helps turn visions into reality by working as the strategic brain of your organization. Thousands of organizations around the world use Cascade to plan, execute, and track their strategies in one place, improving efficiency and speeding up decision-making. By successfully executing their strategies, Cascade customers are making a huge difference around the world, from deploying life-saving vaccines to engineering the fastest Formula One car. If you want to get your team moving toward your vision in one central platform, check us out at cascade.app. We'll leave the link in the episode notes. Now let's get started. Since this is our first episode, we'd love to introduce ourselves to you. For the last decade or so, I've been working with organizations around the world to help improve their efficiencies using tools that deploy health and safety initiatives to AI and everything in between. Miriam, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Laura. And I'm so excited to do these podcasts here with you. My experience is mainly in big corporations for the past 15 years or so. I've been working for large corporations like Siemens and Adidas in strategy and marketing, most recently heading up strategy for Adidas in Canada. And I just love how strategy can be such a powerful way to essentially not only guide your organization's business direction, but also the impact it can have on the culture and the people. So that's why today we're talking about a super interesting topic, and it is the difference between strategy, planning, and execution. Laura, why don't you tell us a little bit more, like, what do you see as this big difference from your perspective between strategy, planning, and execution?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, this is a good topic to talk about because I think for a lot of people, execution is kind of a new buzzword, but really strategy and planning have been around for a long time. I think when it comes to planning, that's where most people feel comfortable. It's quite easy to put pen to paper. It's quite easy to plan what you're going to do. It's much harder to actually execute it and go after it, especially the larger the organization it is and the more people that you have around it, to execute those goals. I think we at Cascade like to talk about why strategy is not the same as planning and why planning is very different to execution. I think in future episodes, we're really going to dig into sort of planning frameworks, execution cultures, how to be more strategic. But I think today we want to talk about, or putting it down in simple terms, what is the difference between strategy, planning, and execution? Why don't you tell us a little bit about why strategy is a theory and where your experience has sort of led you to move into the execution field?
Yeah, I was like really attracted by just strategy overall. Even when I started my career early, I always thought it was such a powerful way, and maybe I just enjoy looking at things holistically. And that's really what strategy is. It is looking at things holistically, and oftentimes with not all of the information that you have. So if you're out there right now and you might need to strategize again, or maybe you're a startup and you actually need to set up your strategy, and then it gets really uncomfortable, right? Because strategy really is that theory. It is like making a choice about where to play and how to play there, and what is that defined playing field where you see your competitive advantage. And that's not super easy, right? Because you really have to assess what is out there already and how do you differentiate yourself and what are you doing different than everybody else. That is really like your strategy that you put out there. And it's essentially a theory because you decide or you assume that that is going to get you to win or to be better than everybody else ultimately. But again, the strategy is oftentimes mistaken also with like strategic planning or anything like that. And I often see like organizations who come to us and they say, yeah, this is our strategy. And it's really just a list of what they want to focus on, or whether like, yeah, like the priorities, and then just some lofty goals. But it's not really like this bigger strategic choice that they have made before they even like start moving into planning. And then it just becomes a little bit like everything else. And oftentimes they wonder like, why is it failing? Or it's like not getting properly executed. So there are so many reasons. But yeah, I see the ones being successful that do make that bold decision in the beginning, and then from there take that strategy and break it down into what are the plans that can help support you to get to that strategy and to support that choice that you have made. How do you ultimately execute it?
I would love to talk about the role.
Yeah.
I would love to talk about the role of planning a little bit, because I think at the beginning I mentioned it's the easy part, and it's not that easy, but it's definitely easier than the execution. I think for a lot of people, strategic planning is probably the most heard of term within the business. It's really that translation of the strategy into those specific steps. I think you would probably agree with me that it's more of that short term. And depending on the organization, that could be a quarter, or it could be a year, or it could be a 3 year, depending on the speed of the organization. But I think that role of planning is obviously very important. You need to know where you're heading in order to be able to get there. But do you want to talk a little bit about maybe the, what do we mean by planning? How would you describe it?
Yeah, I think planning is where I think when you're uncomfortable in making this strategic choice, planning is where the comfort maybe comes in a little bit, because you start to put some control around the plan, right? A plan is usually more cost driven. It is like more resource driven. It's helping you to put essentially almost like a framework around that strategy and that choice that you want to ultimately achieve. So a plan is a lot more tangible. It's a lot easier in many ways. Not to say it is easy, but it is maybe a little bit easier because you actually start with, okay, how many resources do I have? Where do I invest? Like all of these elements that come into play as well to help you build a plan around it. And I mean, a plan, I think maybe I want to talk about that a little bit as well, Laura. I'm curious to see what you think. And you touched on it, like how long should organizations plan for? Like, are we talking 5-year plan or 10-year plans, or 1-year plans and 2-year plans? Like, what's your take on the time horizon of a plan?
So I think definitely we're going to touch on this a little bit more in depth in terms of the framework specifically, but I think every organization should have a short, medium, and long-term plan, and the long term is really determined by the industry and the sort of speed at which your company operates in. So a really good example would be, a fast-paced tech business. Can you really plan 10 years into the future? I don't think you can. You could maybe plan 5, but maybe it's more like a 3-year. For something like a not-for-profit, or, maybe a global organization that's operating in a bit more of a sort of sustainability, or, a bit more of an global impact business, I feel like they're a little bit more slower paced, and maybe that 10-year vision of making the world an amazing place for us all to live, you probably need that long-term planning. And I've even seen some that are 20 years. But in all honesty, the world changes so quickly and so vastly that it's quite hard to have a detailed plan for 10 to 20 years. But there should still be a vision. There still should be a focus that you're going to go after for that long. I think for most people, it's going to fit somewhere around the 1 to 5 years, 1 to 3 years maybe. And again, if you're a fast-paced tech organization, you're probably going to be wanting to review those on a quarterly basis as new technology, like we've seen the explosion of AI technology, things like Bitcoin, NFTs, the explosion of that kind of technology, you need to be able to keep up. And so you need to be at least reviewing your plans. And that's where that execution piece comes in. It's not about reviewing it and making sure the plan still looks good. It's making sure that you still have effective goals and effective resources in order to execute what you set out to achieve, and not being afraid to optimize them if you need to with competitor and external factors as well.
Yeah, and talking about that execution, and we'll have probably an episode that's going into a lot more depth around the speed of execution as well. But really, like what Laura also just said, just to reiterate, if you have those regular review cycles, it also allows you as an organization to act with speed and be agile depending on what's going on in this super fast-paced world. So let's talk a little bit more about execution, because that's really where I like to say the rubber hits the road, and it will actually prove like how good your strategy and your plan are. But even the best plan, I find, it can fall short when you come and start to try to execute, if it's just the plan, right? So we always like to say, on execution, it's coming down to so many elements. And it's really, that's where the coin flips from during strategy and planning. It's probably living a little bit more with the executive team, and you bring in probably some experts just to make people already be part of your planning process. But once you're flipping over to the side of execution, that's really down to every single person in the organization who is going to help execute your strategy. So that flip from like more like the top down and the leadership team, maybe some key experts involved, to everybody in the organization executing the strategy, that's where it's getting really challenging oftentimes to make sure that people are bought in, they love what they hear, they follow the change that you're like proposing, they understand the why, they love the how. It's like a process, and we're talking a lot more about like the change that comes with the execution in a separate episode. But for now, I find like it's just important to point out that it's so important to flip that script and make sure your people are really bought into that plan that you have built and understand the why and the how. But I know there's a lot more to execution. So Laura, why don't you share a little bit more about like what organizations can do to support their execution?
Yeah, I think the execution for me is really when you get that perfect balance of the tactical and operation side of the business and the future vision and strategy, and kind of making the jump between the two really seamless, or as small as possible, essentially. I've seen many organizations that have actually built an amazing strategy, and then everyone's carrying on with what they want to do, or they do this, sort of offsite, and everybody's part of the strategy. But the moment you go back to the office, or you go back to your homes, all is forgotten. And so I think making sure that you set a great plan and you set a great strategy, and everyone's bought into the vision and they're living the values that you set, but also know their part in the execution. Everybody at your organization, even individual contributors, need to know the role that they play in actually executing the strategy. And that can be as simple as, you're part of this team. This is the goal of the team. These are the North Star metrics we're trying to track as a team. And here is the role that you play. And here are the metrics that you can personally impact. And by the way, here are the projects that you're going to run, or involving people and having that bottom up planning as well, where people can say, I think I can run this project that'll have this impact, and they're personally invested in that. And I think that for me is what execution is all about, is that people know the strategy, they live the strategy, and they feel part of it and actually come in day to day and actually execute part of that. And I think for a lot of organizations, that can often stop at sort of the leadership level or the management layer, because they don't feel like anybody else will really care. But I think that's wrong. A lot of people care about the strategy. That's why we join organizations, because we love the vision and we love the mission. And for most people, they join that organization to be part of something great, because they're attracted to that vision. So helping people to know their part in it, I think, is super important, in my opinion. And I think not only that, I think there's a stat that sort of at the leadership layer, almost all leaders know the vision, they know the objectives, they know the focus of the organization, the lower down in the organization you get, that drops to like less than 20%. And that's really scary because it means actually the people who are executing your strategy and a large portion of your business that are responsible for helping you meet your goals actually don't really know what your goals are. And I think that can be the difference between a great company and an amazing high growth company.
Totally. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And the only thing I would probably add is just like one other element to think about as you're like working on really bringing that execution to life is how do you include and how do you keep a regular conversation about everything that you want to execute in your operating cadence or like your management rhythm or whatever it may be called in your organization? How do you have a regular conversation about things? And how do you also acknowledge and praise, celebrate successes, teams, employees, individuals on any different level, just to kind of like keep the energy up, because usually you probably have a really big goal that you want to achieve. So you need your people to be really energized and have them like all in to go for what you want to achieve. But yeah, I feel like that we're gonna start to wrap up this episode. I'm curious to hear from you, Laura. What would you say are your key takeaways or final closing thoughts for this episode?
Yeah, I think I would close up by saying, you can't have one without the other, and you definitely need a good balance of the three. So having that sort of clear strategy, clear vision, clear long-term direction. If you change it too much, change it, too often within the organization, people are going to get really confused about what the latest vision is meant to be. So having that really, really clear and nailed down. I think a detailed plan, again, the role of planning is super important, but you definitely want to move out of sort of the planning phase and not get perfection paralysis around what are we really trying to head for. And then lastly is that flawless execution. I think we've talked about how important it is to bring people on the journey, to regularly monitor your strategy, to regularly have good communication. And I know we're going to touch on that in a lot more depth in later episodes. But what would you say your key takeaways are, and as well as those three elements?
Yeah, first of all, definitely agree with you. And I would say for me, one key element is really that flip from like the strategy sort of creation and planning side to the execution side when it lands in people's hands. Like I know we have also one big statistic that says 90% of strategies fail, and that's usually when you move from the strategy creation phase to that execution phase. And I think for me, the key here is really how it is approached and how the execution is approached, and if just to make sure that it's not just about the what and what you want to achieve, but also to ensure that you include the how, and there is like a certain element of the mindset and the culture included as you're flipping over to the execution side. I think that would be the key for me to make sure strategy execution is ultimately successful. And that's what I've seen in my own experience, that is when things actually are successful, a strong leadership buy-in, and then a strong culture built around the strategy.
I love that. And I know we're going to be touching on culture. We're going to be touching on culture quite heavily in a future episode, which I'm excited to talk about.
That's right.
Well, that wraps up today's episode on the difference between strategy, planning, and execution. Thank you so much, Miriam. It was awesome to talk to you. Hopefully you found it insightful and that it helps you on your journey to better strategy execution.
Yeah, I always love to talk to you as well about our strategy topics, Laura. So for everybody out there, make sure to tune in next week when we'll be talking about how to be more strategic. It's going to be a great episode filled with practical tips, so you don't want to miss that.
And in the meantime, don't forget to subscribe to the Ultimate Strategy Podcast on your favorite platform so you never miss an episode. Check out the links to the resources we mentioned. You'll find them in the episode description. And a big thank you to our sponsor, Cascade, for making this podcast possible.
Thanks for listening. And remember, great strategies are only as good as their execution.
So take action, make it happen, and see the results. See you in the next episode for your weekly dose of strategy.